Last month we started working with some of the ideas that we find in a new book that was published just this last February. The book is called Enlightenment Now by Steven Pinker. It's the case for reason, science, humanism, and progress. And so far we've talked about why people are consistently pessimistic about the state of the world, seemingly determined to ignore the very real evidence of the remarkable progress that's been made in the world over the last 200 years. Now, last week we looked at the actual numbers, which show that our world is becoming wealthier, healthier, safer, and more free and equal. So, to start things off today, I'm going to show a 2-minute video which I think kind of sums up things nicely, where we've been, what we talked about. 2 weeks in just 2 minutes. This is from an organization called Human Progress, and I've given you a link to their website. It's on the summary sheet in your bulletin if you want to go and look at the other things they have to offer. But here's what they have to say.
Is this a bad time to be alive? Reading the news, it's easy to be gloomy about the state of the world and skeptical about humanity's future. But is that pessimism warranted? To be sure, the world will never be perfect. Like our ancestors, future generations will always face serious challenges. But ask yourselves, was there ever a better time to be alive? 15th century hygiene, 16th century human rights, 17th century diet, 18th century dentistry, 19th century working conditions. No, thank you. In fact, evidence clearly shows that humanity has made much progress, especially over the last 200 years. So follow the trend lines, not the headlines. You will discover that people today live longer and healthier lives. They're better fed, more educated, richer, safer, and freer. Reason, science, and humanism are transforming our lives, elevating human welfare beyond that enjoyed by the kings and queens of yesteryear. Humanprogress.org bridges the gap between mistaken perceptions and reality. With an intuitive interface and modern design, the website brings together long-term trends and the latest breakthroughs in human development. Use our advanced visualization tools to view the progress of different countries and regions. There are hundreds of datasets to explore, all from reliable external sources. It's easy to create customized charts, make cross-country comparisons, and share what you discover. Access humanprogress.org and start exploring the evidence of human progress.
And that's not the only site out there. There's another organization called Gapminder. When you search for that one, you'll link to others, and it's amazing the work that people are doing to present this information. And like he said at the end there, start exploring the evidence. That's always the best place to start. And even our Unity co-founder, Charles Fillmore, stressed the need to evaluate a claim. You need to evaluate a claim in order to determine whether or not it's true. You see, there are a lot of really, really bad reasons for accepting a claim as true. Here's a few. Faith, dogma, revelation, authority, charisma, divination, visions, gut feelings, and of course interpreting sacred texts. That last one continues to cause us some problems because, as everyone knows from that sacred text called the Bible, the earth and the cosmos were created in 6 days, which explains why just last week in Arizona there was an attempt to try to remove the word evolution from public school curricula, which was defeated, but the beat goes on, if you know what I mean. Well, Charles Fillmore was not interested in those kinds of bad reasons for accepting something as true. Back in 1918, he wrote an article called "The Pure Reason and Honest Logic of Practical Christianity." Pure reason, honest logic. And this is how he described unity back then. He said, "It has no dogmas nor creeds, nor are its students expected to believe anything which they cannot logically demonstrate to be true. It takes as the basis of its doctrine a fundamental truth that is known, and from that truth, by cold, deductive reasoning, arrives at each and every one of the conclusions which are presented. Thus, it does not in any manner partake of the popular concept of religion as a vague something that has to be accepted on faith and believed regardless of its consistencies. I should say inconsistencies. On the contrary, it invites the closest mental scrutiny." That's the way Charles explained it. But I think we want to have something that's so easy to remember that it'll fit on a t-shirt. So here you go. Demand evidence and think critically. Both Karen and I have one of those t-shirts, which we wear frequently. It really says that it really speaks to how unity differs so radically from traditional religion. That statement by Charles Fillmore flies in the face of what happened during and after the Reformation in traditional religion. I think we can sum up traditional religion with this one quote from Martin Luther, who was the leader of the Protestant Reformation, or perhaps we should call it the Protestant Rebellion. He said, "Reason must be deluded, blinded, and destroyed. Faith must trample underfoot all reason, sense, and understanding, and whatever it sees must be put out of sight and know nothing but the Word of God," which says that the earth was created in 6 days, and so on and so forth. You know, usually a rebellion, like the Reformation, most rebellions are designed to set people free. People rebel because they want freedom, but not in the case of the Reformation. They ended up replacing one form of religious tyranny with another, and then started doing the backwards walk, retreating step by step into superstition and darkness once again. But you know what they say about darkness, right? "'Tis better to light one little candle than to curse the darkness," which is what people did. They lit the candle of human reason. Out of that darkness came light, or perhaps I should say the Enlightenment. Here's a high school history class definition of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment was an intellectual movement developed mainly in France, Britain, and Germany in the 1700s, which advocated freedom, democracy, and reason as the primary values of society. It's not so mysterious. I think all of us here have the great fortune not to remember, not to know what life and living was like in the 1700s as the Enlightenment was getting underway. Government was primarily in the hands of kings and queens, and even if there was some kind of a system that attempted at a form of democracy like parliament, representation, something like that, it was still dominated by this class of people who were arbitrarily elevated to the status of being nobles. They held titles. They were of noble blood, and therefore they were superior to other people. The lower classes of human beings were expected to be obedient and deferential to all different kinds of authority, not just royalty, not just nobility. They were to be deferential and obedient to clergy, priests, bishops, and things like that. The list goes on and on. You did not question anything. You weren't allowed to think for yourself, but you were expected to submit to the wisdom of your betters, who would explain to you what it was that God expected of you. Well, in his book Enlightenment Now, Steven Pinker, he quotes a historian who came up with a list of the interesting things that a supposedly well-educated pre-Enlightenment English person would believe, say in the year 1600. Get this. that person would believe that witches can summon storms that sink ships, that werewolves are to be found in Belgium, mice are spontaneously generated in piles of straw. Yeah.
Sort of true.
Go figure, yeah. And this one, I just threw this in there because it was so bizarre. A murdered body will bleed in the presence of its murderer. I mean, just think of all the different superstitious stuff we've heard of, you know, the black cat nonsense and things like that, on and on. You get the idea, right? Today we call that stuff superstition. And the best definition of superstition that I know of is believing something on insufficient evidence. Superstition is believing something without sufficient evidence. So the Enlightenment didn't just dismantle all of that, it blew it to smithereens. And the reason it succeeded so well is because it delivered the goods. Our Declaration of Independence, our Constitution, the Bill of Rights, are all examples of products of Enlightenment thinking, as is the Unity movement itself. This is our inheritance, both as a secular democracy and as a spiritual community. And like anything else that we inherit, we get to decide what we're going to do with it. And unfortunately, it appears as if maybe people might be taking this inheritance for granted, starting to undervalue it or ignore it, which is one of the reasons why Steven Pinker wrote this book. All of the progress that we've been talking about for 2 weeks came about because entire cultures embraced the principles of free thought and reason as primary values. So here's what the author is concerned about. He says, more than ever, the ideals of reason, science, humanism, and progress need a wholehearted defense. We take its gifts for granted. Newborns who will live more than 8 decades. Markets overflowing with food. Clean water that appears with the flick of a finger and waste that disappears with another. Pills that erase a painful infection. Critics of the powerful who are not jailed or shot. The world's knowledge and culture available in a shirt pocket. These are human accomplishments, not cosmic birthrights. And war, scarcity, disease, ignorance, and lethal menace are a natural part of existence. We know that countries can slide back into these primitive conditions, and so we ignore the achievements of the Enlightenment at our peril. Reason, science, humanism, and progress. And Steven Pinker is suggesting that we need to double down on those ideas and bring them into the 21st century. That's an important step because at one point in the book he quotes the economist Friedrich Hayek, who once said this: "If old truths are to retain their hold on men's minds, they must be restated in the language and concepts of successive generations." Now when I read that, I immediately stuck a note in there because that sounds almost identical to something that Unity minister and author Eric Butterworth has to say about the Unity movement in particular and religion in general. Here's what Eric Butterworth had to say. "A religion, to be a contemporary influence, must be redefined for every generation in the light of that day's thought." So, if we don't re-examine, reevaluate, and update and redefine the values of the Enlightenment, or the values of Unity for that matter, we run the risk of slipping backwards into bondage, darkness, ignorance, things like that. This applies to our culture in general and Unity in particular. The Fillmores gave us a great gift. They gave us this alternative path to truth that was free from the kind of authoritarianism and appeal to supernatural forces that was forced upon people way back when. But just because a movement starts out that way is no guarantee of saying that it's going to stay that way, saying that it's going to stay as a way of liberation. For example, Robert Ingersoll was a contemporary of Charles Fillmore. He was a well-known free thinker and a very popular speaker on the lecture circuit who Charles actually quoted in several of his publications. And here's something that Robert Ingersoll observed. He said, most people cling to the supernatural. If they give up one God, they imagine another. Ain't it the truth? You know, Unity takes great pride in pointing out that we do not engage in a literal interpretation of the Bible. We consider it to be a combination of myth, allegory, literature, poetry, and indeed some history. We reject the claims of the biblical prophets who insisted that they had a direct line to God, who gave them special revelations and knowledge that wasn't available to the rest of us, that they would impart to us. We reject that, and yet today there are plenty of books by spiritual teachers and gurus who claim that they have authority imparted by otherworldly sources, secret knowledge, special revelations, not available to us ordinary folks. They claim to have no ego, a direct line, that they are somehow more, I don't know, what's the popular term today, woke? Has anyone heard that term? Ugh. Anyway, they claim that they have no ego, they are somehow on a higher level than the rest of us, and they set up another spiritual class system, or maybe I should even say a caste system. They give us new versions of holy books that are then given the same deference and authority that a fundamentalist still gives to the Bible. The difference is a matter of form. It seems benign and positive, but it still requires us to surrender our hard-won freedom of thought. And instead of evolving and moving forward, we actually take a step backwards into bondage and superstition, because it's easier to just believe instead of demanding evidence. Or to put it in the words of Charles Fillmore, it's easier to just believe instead of applying the closest mental scrutiny. So I think all of us stand to benefit greatly by doubling down on the values of reason, science, humanism, and progress. By embracing them, by studying them. They were core values for Charles Fillmore, and they need to be updated and redefined. I have all of Charles Fillmore's books now digitally, and it's easy to do a search when you have it that way. I did a search for the word science. It pops up hundreds of times in his work. That was a value for him. He had a slightly different idea of what science meant. I mean, he's coming from the Victorian era. We've learned a few things. Things have changed since then. It needs to be redefined, refined, and updated. We've already talked about Charles's fondness for logic and reason, but they need to be updated. You may have noticed in that quote that Charles talks only about deductive reasoning. Today, we know that there is so much more to clear reasoning than just deduction. Then we come to the word humanism. Well, I know some Unity folks who have what you might call an allergic reaction to that word, as if the worst thing in the world is to be called a secular humanist. I just don't get it. Here's a great little definition of humanism from the book. The goal of maximizing human flourishing, life, health, happiness, freedom, knowledge, love, richness of experience may be called humanism. And we can include animals in that goal. But it has to start with us, because we're the ones who formulate the ideas. So why would anyone have a problem with making human flourishing a value, a goal, something to be pursued? We started today with that video, which asked the question, was there ever a better time to be alive? And I think it makes the case that we really don't want to go back. And the truth is that we can't. But we can get stuck and stop moving forward. And that can be just as bad as actually going back in time. We can get stuck, and who knows? Maybe we'll get stuck and one day we'll have open sewers and resorting to bleeding people to treat a fever. I mean, it could get that bad. So let's keep the Enlightenment going, Unity. It's consistent with our history and our purpose, and next week we'll start taking a look at how we can be instrumental in making that happen. See you then.